Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We'll be learning today Meretz Hashem, Daf Samach Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Shofar. We pick up on Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis. You know what? We're in Siman Tov Kuf Pei Vav. We're in the midst of Sif Ches. I'm going to begin reading the Mechaber from the beginning of Sif Ches, Nun Tes Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Not going to go over the Mishnah Berurah again, but just in order to be in the context, to have everything in the proper context, I'm going to read from the beginning of Sif Ches. So the Mechaber said, Nistak la'arkoi, if we have a shofar that's split along its length, puzzle. The Mechaber said right away that a shofar that splits along its length is puzzle. Yesh Aimrim afilu b'chol shehu puzzle. There are those that say that even if it's a slight crack, even if the length of the crack is only a kol shehu, a minute amount, it's still puzzle. And the Mishnah Berurah explained that the reason for that is because this shita feels once a shofar develops a crack in its length, that crack is inevitably going to expand. Therefore, this is a shofar which is amidli sadek, it's standing to be split. This crack is going to continue, it's going to lengthen from the pressure of the blowing of the shofar, and it's going to split, and a split shofar is not kosher. The Mechaber gave us an eitzah for a shofar that only has a slight crack. If you bind it tightly with a string or with some kind of a band so that we need not be concerned that the crack will lengthen, then it's okay. However, the Ramah said, the Ramah required that if you're going to tie it or you're going to put some kind of band around it, the Ramah requires that there be the minimum share of a shofar from the mouthpiece until where the crack is. And the Mishnah Berurah, we learned yesterday, said many Achrayim dispute that. Then we had another opinion, Dafka Berubai, that says that the shofar is not going to be puzzled just because it has a minute crack in its length, because we're concerned that the crack is going to split. This shita, and this is brought from the Magid Mishnah, this shita holds that the shofar only becomes puzzled if the split is along the majority of the length of the shofar. Then it's puzzled because rubai kikulai, since the majority of the shofar is split, we already look at it as being a split shofar, and a split shofar is not kosher because it loses the shem shofar. It's not called a shofar anymore. The word shofar comes from shveiferes. A shveiferes is a closed tube, and this is split along one side, so this is not called a shofar. Now the Mechaber continues, and the Mechaber says, Ve'im dibkoi. Let's say you have a shofar that is split along its length for the majority of the shofar. But ve'im dibkoi, now you went ahead and you glued the crack closed, then kosher. Then the Mechaber says that would render the shofar kosher. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut mem dalid ve'im dibkoi, ve'dafka bedevek machshirinon, we would make this shofar kosher, we would make this shofar kosher if you glued the crack, because by using glue, we consider the shofar to be complete once again. But in this case, where the Mechaber is speaking about a shofar which developed a crack along the majority of its length, you cannot use the eitzah of binding it with a string or with a band. Over here, you must use glue. If you use glue, we consider the shofar to be whole once again. But to just use a band or a string, you cannot do. Kevan shenistak rubai. Since over here we're talking about a shofar which split along the majority of its length, we're not going to rely on a rope or a band because we say rubai kikulai. This is considered as if it's split. And by binding it, you're not making it no longer split. That's not a repair. The reason why binding it works when you have a minute crack, according to the first shita brought down by the Mechaber, is because over there, the crack really does not render the shofar puzzle. The reason the shofar is puzzle is because we're concerned that the crack is going to lengthen and then the shofar will become puzzle. But if you bind it, we need not be concerned that the crack is going to lengthen. But over here now, we're speaking about a shofar that's already cracked in its majority. Rubai kikulei, it's a split shofar, it's puzzle. If you glue it, the gluing it affects a repair. Now we consider the shofar to be whole once again. Binding it doesn't affect a repair. Binding it only makes that the crack shouldn't lengthen. So over here, binding it would not be an eitzah. Ice cut memhei. So the Mechaber said, if you glue it, it's kosher. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hainu afilu loy nishtaya rak kol shehu shaloi nistak. This is true, even if the shofar developed a crack not only along the majority of its length, but almost its entire length is cracked. There's only a minute amount left of the length of the shofar that is not cracked. Still, if you go ahead and you glue it, the shofar is considered to be whole according to this shita, and the shofar is kosher. So, says the Chavetz Chaim, afilu loy nishtaya rak kol shehu shaloi nistak. Even if only a minute amount of the shofar remained that is not cracked, kosher kishedipkai. The Magen Avram and other Achrayim say, if you glue it, the shofar is kosher. Continues the Mechaber, near the end of the line, on the bottom line, and the Mechaber says, afilu im dipkai bedevek. This is true, even if you're using glue. Glue is not min b'minoi. Glue is not shofar material, it's non-shofar material. Says the Mechaber, if you're gluing the shofar together when it was cracked, even if you use glue, which is non-shofar material, the shofar is still kosher. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cut memvav on the bottom line, dipkei b'devek, ve'ein zeh nikra shaloi b'minoi. We don't have a problem here of shaloi b'minoi. Yesterday we learned, or maybe it was already the day before. No, I think it was yesterday. No, the day before. If a shofar has a hole, and you plug up that hole with something which is she'enoi minoi, if you plug up the hole with some sort of a glue, which is non-shofar material, then the shofar is puzzle, because we say that you're blowing the shofar, and what you're hearing is shofar v'davar acher. You're not only hearing the sound of a shofar, you're hearing the sound of a shofar and some foreign material. Over here, by a cracked shofar, even though you repair the crack with glue, we don't recognize a problem of einoi minoi. Why not? Says the Chavetz Chaim, Teshani nistak minikev, because this case, where we're talking about a shofar that developed a crack, is different than the case of the shofar that became punctured. De'ena devek nikar bein hadvekim. When you have a hole in a shofar and you put in a plug, the plug is a material that's filling up an empty space, and you could see it. It's nicker. It's something which is recognizable. But over here, when you have a crack, what do? You put glue along one edge, along one surface of the crack, glue along the other surface of the crack, and you stick it together. Now, it's not nicker. It's not something which is recognizable. And therefore, we don't worry that there's an einoi minoi presence over here. However, says the Chavetz Chaim on Samach Hamad Aleph, v'im hasedek rachav, if you're talking about a wide crack, v'nikar hadevek, and when you put in the glue somehow is going to be recognizable. It's some kind of a split that has a width to it, so it's not just that you're gluing the surfaces together, you're really filling the crack, so then you're going to see it, then bevada yesh lahachmer bazeh. Then the Chavetz Chaim brings down from the Graz that certainly there's room for a chumrah and you should not use it. Now it's similar to the case of the shofar that became punctured and you filled up the hole with something which is she'enoi minoi. Nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, efshar it's possible if the sound of the shofar after you glue it is the same as it was before the shofar became split, you don't have to be machmer if roiv of the shofar was uncracked. Why? Because we learned earlier in Siv Zayin that according to the Rush and others, if you have two positive factors to be machshir the shofar is kosher. The chanal b'Siv Zayin, v'tzarachiyun. What the Chavetz Chaim means over here is, If we're talking about a case where rove of the shofar, excuse me, was not cracked, so you have one positive factor, which is that you have rove. If the sound of the shofar also is back to the way it was before the shofar ever became cracked, so that's a second positive factor, that the sound of the shofar is back to its original sound. You're lacking one of the three factors, which is that you filled up this crack with a davar she'enoi minoi, with non-shofar material. But in Siv Zayin we learned that according to the Rush and others who agree with the Rush, if you have two positive factors, you don't need all three. So then b'di'evid we said that shofar would be okay. So too possibly over here, and the Chavetz Chaim says v'tzarech iyun. Okay. Now we continue in the Mechaber, the last word on Nun Tes Amud Beis. V'yesh mi she'omer she'enoi kosher. However, there are those that say, and this is brought down from the Torah in the name of the Ramban, there are those that say, she'enoi kosher, that the shofar which developed a crack along its length is not kosher, ela kishedibkoi ba'atzmai. You cannot use glue. You have to use the shofar material itself. And the Mechaber explains how you would do that. Shechimemoi ba'ur, and that means that you heat up the shofar with a flame, ad shenifshar, until the shofar material softens and melts. The chiber kitzaisav zeh mizeh. You're doing some kind of a weld. What you're doing is you're softening the material and melting the material to the extent where when you press the surfaces together, they will bind and they will hold together. So that there is no glue, there is no einoi minoi over here at all. Says the Chavetz Chaim, ois cotton mem zayin, ba'atzmoi, you're gluing it together using its own material, aval bedevek, but this shita holds, the Torah in the name of the Ramban holds, that if you use glue, heavy k'may stamay shaloi b'minoi, that would be akin to the case of the punctured shofar that you plugged with non-shofar material. V'dinoi k'may shekasa b'siv zayin, and the halacha of that shofar would be identical to the halacha that we learned in Siv Zayin of the punctured shofar, where we have the two shitas. We have the shita of the Rambam and the shita of the Rosh. And now, according to the Rambam, you're plugging the shofar with something with his she'enoi minoi, it's puzzle. According to the Rush, if you have the other two positive factors, it could be kosher. With Svara Rishayna Iker, however, the Chavetz Chaim says that Me'ikr Hadin, we follow the first shita brought down by the Mechaber, the shita of the Magid Mishnah, that if you use glue, it's kosher. Nevertheless, as the Chavetz Chaim, im nishtane koiloi, if the sound of the shofar is different after you glue it, yesh lahachmer, you should rule stringently and not use this shofar, shaloi b'shas adchak, unless you have a shas adchak, lachzor v'liskaya, if possible, if at all possible, you should find another shofar and blow again, ubli bracha, without making a bracha. Now we go to the second line of the Mechaber, v'im nistakuloi. Let's say the shofar split along its entire length. Until now, we spoke about a shofar that split just a kol shu, just a minute amount. Then we spoke about a shofar that split along the majority of its length. Now we're talking about a shofar that splits from end to end, throughout its entire thickness, even only on one side. Says the Mechaber, v'emnista kuloi, if the shofar cracked and split along its entire length, afilu mitzad echad, even if it's only on one side of the shofar. So we're not talking that the shofar split mamish into two pieces. No, it's still held together on one side. But on one side, it's split along its entire length, through its entire thickness. Puzzle. That shofar is puzzle. Afilu chimimai ba'ur, even if you heat it up in a flame, the chiber stuck of zeh mzeh, and you weld together the two sides of the crack, you cannot make a repair on this shofar. This shofar is completely, permanently puzzle. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, ois katan memches. Puzzle, this shofar is puzzle, and the reason for this is something that we've already explained previously. To sue ein shem shofar alav, because this is no longer called a shofar. Kevin shenistak kuloi, since it's split along its entire length, it's no longer a shofar. A shveiferes, a tube, has to be closed on 3 sides. This is not a tube. It's split along its entire length on one side. So that's it. It's all over. This shofar is puzzle and it cannot be repaired. Says the Mechaber Siftes. Nistak l'rochbai. Let's say the shofar is split along its width. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cut in memtes. Nistak l'rochbai. It's split along its width. Hainu saviv hekefai. What we mean by that is around its circumference. I keep on saying that I'm going to bring a shofar. I have to remember to bring a shofar upstairs. If this is a shofar, it's not big enough to really see it on the, well, is it? On the video? Yeah, it is big enough. If this is the shofar, so till now we were speaking about a shofar that cracked along its length. That would be in that direction. Now we're talking about a shofar that splits around its width. Saviv hekefai. So says the Mechaber, Nistak l'rochbai. If the shofar split around its width, bimiyutai, if it only split less than the majority of its circumference, a minority of its circumference, kosher. The shofar is kosher. Now let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah. I didn't read the entire memtes, so I'm going to read from the beginning of memtes. Nistak l'rochbai, the shofar split around its width. Hainu saviv hekefai, surrounding its circumference. And the Chavetz Chaim says, Uba, this type of crack develops al yedei nefila, by dropping the shofar, al yahaka b'chayzik, or by striking the shofar hard. Now, I believe the reason the Chavetz Chaim mentions this is because the point of the Chavetz Chaim is this kind of crack does not develop from the pressure of blowing the shofar. And furthermore, this kind of crack will not expand by the pressure of blowing the shofar. This is the type of crack that happens from striking it, from impact. It's an impact crack. And we'll see why that's negeya. Says the Chavetz Chaim in Ois Katan Nud, b'miyutai kosher. If it's only a minority, if it's less than the majority of the circumference of the shofar that is cracked, the shofar is kosher. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'loi dami l'nistak la'arkoi. This is not similar to the case of the shofar that split along its length. De pasal b'sivches l'deir rishona. In Sivches, that I started the share with, I read from the beginning of Sivches, we said that according to the first opinion, according to the shita of the Magid Mishnah, I keep forgetting who it is. No, the Rosh, I'm sorry. According to the shita of the Rosh, in Sivches, in the beginning of Sivches, if the shofar cracked along its length, even if it's a kol shehu, the shofar is puzzle. Now we explained why is it puzzle, because we're afraid that the crack is going to expand. That's why it's puzzle. The kol shehu crack itself doesn't inherently puzzle the shofar, but the problem is that we are concerned that the crack is going to expand. Over here, when we're talking about a crack that goes around the width of the shofar, over here the Mechaber said that if the crack is only a miut, if it's only a minority of the way around the shofar, then it's not puzzle. Why don't we say that we're concerned that the crack is going to expand? So the Chavetz Chaim explains, this is not similar to the case of the beginning of Sivches, to the shofar that cracks along its length. The pasal b'sivches l'deir rishona, that according to the first opinion, the opinion of the Rosh, brought down at the beginning of Sivches, such a crack passes the shofar. What's the difference? Mishum desham, because over there, when we're dealing with a crack that's along the length, al yedei chayzik atakiya yachal ipaka yoser ba'orich. Over there, we're concerned that that crack will expand from the pressure of blowing the shofar. Avaloi b'roichav. But when we're dealing with a crack that goes around the width of the shofar, we are not concerned that that split is going to expand. Somehow the physics of this, the Chavetz Chaim is telling us from the Rishonim, the Chavetz Chaim is telling us that along the length, we're afraid pressure will split the shofar. But we're not afraid that the pressure of blowing the shofar, we're not afraid that a piece of the shofar somehow is going to blow off, or that a crack that's going around is going to expand. The pressure is pushing out on the walls this way. So that's going to expand cracks along the length. It's not going to expand cracks that are along the width. Okay, continues the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said, Nistak l'rachbai mimiyutai kasher, Berurah puzzle. If the crack extends the majority of the way around the shofar, then the shofar is puzzle. Says the Chavetz Chaim in Eis Katan on Aleph. You know what? Let me read the Mechaber further. I'm sorry. Berurah puzzle. If it goes the majority of the way around the shofar, then it's puzzle. Ella imke nishar me'asedek litzad piv shir tekiah. Unless, when you have the shofar like this, if from the mouthpiece of the shofar until the location of the crack that goes around the width, you have a shear of a shofar. If you have a tefach at the beginning of the shofar, at the mouthpiece of the shofar, you have a tefach, then even if the crack up here goes around the width, the shofar is not puzzle. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Eis Katan Nun Aleph. Berurah puzzle, if the crack along the width extends around the majority of the circumference of the shofar, then the shofar is puzzle. Ella im kain, unless you have a sheer shofar, you have a tefach from the mouthpiece until the crack. The bazeh, explains the Chavetz Chaim, the bazeh, in this case, where you have a majority of the shofar down here, afilu chashvinu limiyuta kemisha enoi, then even if you're going to say that the minority of the circumference of the shofar, which is not cracked, you'll say it's as if it's not there. In other words, what the Chavetz Chaim is saying is like this. Remember, we said that by a crack, we say rubai kikulai. And that's why we said, in Sif Ches over here, we said that if you have a crack that runs along the majority, the roiv, of the length of the shofar is puzzle. Why? Because rubai kikulai, and we consider it completely cracked. So, okay, now let's say you have a crack that goes around the roiv, the majority of the width of the shofar. So let's say we say rubai kikulai. All right, so we say rubai kikulai, and now it means that the top section of the shofar, at the wide end of the shofar, is completely cracked off, because there's a crack that goes around the circumference of the shofar. It goes the majority of the way around. We say rubai kikulai. That means that the entire circumference of the shofar is cracked. If the entire circumference of the shofar is cracked, then the top piece of the shofar on the wide end is removed. Halachically, we should look at it as it's removed. Says the Chavetz Chaim, as long as you have a shear of the shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack, then that's not a problem. Let's see the Chavetz Chaim inside. The bazeh, in this case, where the crack goes around the majority of the shofar, but you have the minimum shear of the shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack, so afilu chashbina lemiyuta kemisha einai. So even if we look at the miyut of the circumference of the shofar, which is not cracked, and we say it's as if it's not there because rubai kikulai ukemai nichras kulai, and therefore it's as if the whole top of the shofar is actually cut off and isn't there. Haloi al kol panim nisha sher tkiya. So what? You still have the bottom part of the shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack, which is there, and that has the minimum size of the shofar. So why should you passel the shofar? What are you worried about? You're worried about this piece on top? That piece on top, you might think that there's a logical reason to passel the shofar because of the presence of that piece on top. What would that be? Well, the logic for that would be that we're going to see in tomorrow's shir B'Yetz Hashem in Sif Yod Aleph. Let's say you have a perfectly kosher shofar. You have a beautiful, nice, long shofar. But you decided that you want to have the biggest shofar in town. So you took another piece of a shofar and you glued it on. You made an extension on your shofar. That extension passels your shofar. Now, you'll say, well, Rabbi Weiss, why does it passel the shofar? I have more than a shear of shofar from the mouthpiece until my extension. Why does the extension passel the shofar? The reason is, we're going to see in Sif Yod Aleph, that by extending the shofar, now you created a problem. Because shofar echad amarachmana, the pasuk says that you have to blow shofar. It uses a singular lashon, shofar, which means that you have to blow in one shofar, not in two shofars. by making an extension on your shofar, now that's not a natural part of the shofar. So now it's not considered one shofar. It's two pieces. It's two shofars. And therefore it's possible for blowing. So you might want to apply that logic to our case over here. You'll say, okay, over here we have a sheer shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack. But the crack, since the crack goes roiv around the shofar, so now we say rubai kekulai, and now the top of the shofar is halachically considered to be cut off. But it's not cut off. It's still there. So maybe we should view it as two different pieces, and we should say shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shtei shofros. Sounds like a very convincing argument. Says the Chavetz Chaim, it does not apply over here. Why doesn't it apply? Let's see the Chavetz Chaim inside. He says, v'oisai ha'oidef, that extra piece on the top of the shofar that we are halachically viewing as if it was cut off, ein lechashvoi k'may ha'safa. We don't look at it as an extension. Lifsoil al yedei zeh kol ha-shofar, so that by virtue of that extension we should render the entire shofar puzzle ukidl kamei b'sif yod aleph, like we're going to see the halacha in sif yod aleph. Why not? Deloi mikri ha'safa, because we don't view the extra piece on top of the shofar as being a extension which invalidates the shofar. Ela kishahayatchila chaticha acheres. Only if originally that extension was a separate piece. In Sif Yod Aleph, we're talking about you had a shofar, you took a separate piece and you glued it on. Then it's shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shtei shofros. This was a separate piece. You glued on a foreign piece, a separate piece. So now you have two shofros. Masha ain't came kan, but over here we're talking about this was a natural part of the shofar. Delay nifrad me'olam. It never separated. It never was physically separated from the shofar. It's got a crack that runs roiv of the way around, so you're tempted to, so halachically we say rubai kekulai, and halachically it's as if it's removed, but physically it was never removed. So it's not a separate piece that you put on as an extension. You can't say over here, shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shtei shofros. It's zichur shofar echad. And therefore that psul does not apply over here. Okay. So the words of the Mechaber was, El im kein nishar me'asedek litzad piv shir tkiya. Okay, says the Chavetz Chaim, is cutting on base. Nishar me'asedek, you have to have that from the crack to the mouthpiece, you should have a share of a shofar. Now, says the Chavetz Chaim, vim divkoi bedevek. How about if you glued it? Afilu loy nishar shir tkiya nami kosher. Then the Chavetz Chaim says, if you had a crack that ran the majority of the way around the circumference of the shofar, and you glued that crack together, then the Chavetz Chaim says that would be kosher. Afilu loy nishar shir tkiya nami kosher, even if you do not have the minimum size of the shofar from the mouthpiece to the crack. Ukemoidim kalinon besifches, like we had the kula in the beginning of today's shir in Sivches, benistak ba'arkoi, in the case of the shofar that cracked along its length, kishadibkoi bedevek, and you glued it with glue, right? We started off the shir with that case. You had a shofar that was split along the majority of its length, and you glued it. And we said ve'im dibkoi kosher. If you glue it with glue, it's kosher, at least according to that shita. Nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, if you have a different shofar you could use, it would be better to use that shofar. Says the Chavetz Chaim in the parentheses, echad, one reason why it would be better to use the other shofar is we had the second opinion in Sivches at the beginning of today's share. We had the opinion of the Torah that devek is considered einoi minoi, and therefore if you glue the shofar, it's not kosher. So you have the das of the Torah in the name of the Ramban. So better use a different shofar that doesn't have devek. And another reason, the Gamlu das Rabbeinu Yohainason the devek loy mahadi b'mukam sedek. You also have a Rabbeinu Yohainason. The Rabbeinu Yohainason also says that glue is not effective, And, oh yes, the reason Rabbeinu Yonason says glue is not effective is because Rabbeinu Yonason says that by glue, he's not convinced that the glue is going to withstand the pressure of the blowing of the shofar. And therefore, Rabbeinu Yonason doesn't want to hear about glue. Now, some ask on the Chavetz Chaim, how could the Chavetz Chaim mention the sheet of Rabbeinu Yonason over here? Rabbeinu Yonason's whole problem with glue is that the pressure of the blowing is going to make the shofar split again. He feels that glue is not a valid repair. But over here we're talking about a crack in the circumference, in the width. And the Chavetz Chaim himself told us that when you're dealing with a crack in the width, we're not concerned with the pressure of the blowing. So therefore, some ask on the Chavetz Chaim, it seems strange that he brought down the Rabbeinu Yonason here. Okay, Eis Katan Nun Gimel. Litzad Piv, as long as you have a sheer shofar from the crack to the mouthpiece. Then the Chavetz Chaim said, we don't have to worry about the crack, because even if the piece after the crack is considered halachically removed, it doesn't matter. We have an entire shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack. Eis Katan Nun Gimel Litzad Piv, Dafka. When the Mechaber says that you need the minimum share of shofar from the mouthpiece to the crack, he was being very precise. That's where you need to have the share shofar. Shaharei royan hanistak keman denichras. Because the logic of this is that we view the piece of the shofar after the crack as being cut off. And now we have a shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack, and therefore if you blow in it, it's kosher. If you don't have the minimum size of a shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack, so now you're blowing in a shofar that doesn't have the minimum shear, and it's possible. Now let's go back to the Mechaber. 3 lines from the bottom by the Eis Katan Nun Daled for the Mishnah Berurah. So what is the minimum shear of the shofar? Dahainu arba gudlim, the 4 thumb widths. That's arba gudlim, which aka is a tefach. So that's the shear, the minimum shear that you have to have from the mouthpiece to the crack. Eis Katan Nun Daled, dahainu arba gudlim shel adam beinani, 4 thumb widths of an average sized person. Umaydidin be'emtza ha'agudel, and we measure the width of the thumb at the middle of the thumb, at the wide point of the thumb. V'loy b'roish ha'gudel, not at the tip of the thumb, where the thumb gets narrower. That's not where we measure from. V'hu shir tefach, and the share of arba gudlim is actually the share of a tefach, somewhere between 8 and 9.5 centimeters, depending on the shita. Okay. Continues the Mechaber. 3 lines from the bottom. If you do have the minimum share of a shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack, then kosher, then the shofar is kosher, even though it's split around the majority of its circumference, afilu im ma'akev esatkiya, even if this crack has changed the sound of the shofar. Eis Katan Nun Hey, afilu im ma'akev esatkiya, even if it changed the sound of the shofar. Why? Deloi gara minike v'loi nistam, because this is no worse than the case of the punctured shofar that you did not plug up. Let's remember, we said in the beginning of Siv Zayin, when we first started speaking about a punctured shofar, we said if a shofar has a puncture in it, we said if a shofar has a puncture in it, the shofar is kosher, even though the sound of the shofar changed by virtue of the puncture. Why? Because any coil of a shofar is kosher. So the coil of this shofar is now this coil. It's kosher. When you go to plug the puncture up, that's when you're creating problems. And that's when we have to know, did you plug it up with shofar material or non-shofar material, and etc., etc. But the fact that the hole changes the sound of the shofar is fine. So too over here, says the Chavetz Chaim, Deloi gara minikev, our case over here where the shofar is cracked around the circumference of the shofar, that's no worse than the shofar that had a puncture, v'loi nistam, and you didn't try to plug it, the machshirina le'el, we said at the beginning of Zion, it's kosher, afilu b'nishtana kailoi, even if the sound of the shofar changed. Continues the Mechaber, V'yesh machshirin b'nishtayir afilu shaloi l'tzad piv. This is very interesting. First, the Mechaber told us if you have a crack that goes around the roiv of the circumference of the shofar, so if you have the minimum shear shofar from the mouthpiece to the crack, the shofar is kosher. And that logic has been very, very easy for us to understand, because we say, even if we view the top of the shofar as being physically removed, because rubai kikulai, still the shofar is kosher, because all right, I'm blowing with this shofar down here. I'm blowing with the shofar from the mouthpiece until the crack. And that's a minimum size shofar. So the shofar is kosher. But we said you need to have the minimum size of the shofar from the mouthpiece to the crack. Over there you have to have the minimum size shofar. If you don't have the minimum size here, if you have the minimum size up here, we said that's puzzle. Because what do you mean? You don't have it down here, so you're not blowing in a kosher shofar. Now, says the Mechaber, for yesh makshirim, you should know that there are those that are makshir. This is the Bala Iter and the Ritz Geus. There are those that are makshir the shofar, benishtayer afilu shaloi litzad piv. Even if there's a minimum size of the shofar, not by the mouthpiece, but rather up on the other side of the crack, it's still kosher. Now that logic is much more difficult to explain. So let's see what the Chavetz Chaim says. Chavetz Chaim says in Ois Katan Nun Vav, Afilu shaloi litzad piv, even if the minimum shear is not down by the mouthpiece. V'af al pi shezeh miut shebepiv chaytzeitz. Right away, the Chavetz Chaim says, I don't understand. How could this be kosher? You have the shofar like this. You want to tell me, you can't tell me that it's kosher because of this piece down here. This piece down here doesn't have the minimum size of a shofar. So what do you want to tell me? You want to tell me it's kosher because I have the minimum share of a shofar up here. I'm trying to position this for the camera. Up here. Says the Chavetz Chaim, how could that be kosher? You're going to tell me that you're blowing with this shofar? But the mouth is down here. So this section of the shofar should form a chatzitza. It should form a hefsek and an interruption between your mouth and the kosher part of the shofar up here. So how is that kosher? So says the Chavetz Chaim, even though this too small section of the shofar that's in your mouth should be a chatzitza between your mouth and the shofar, the kosher part of the shofar, so there's a separation between your mouth and the kosher shofar. According to the Ritz Geus and the Pala Itor, we're not concerned about that. Why? Because like species do not form a chatzitza. What's the chatzitza? The chatzitza is a small, non-kosher section of shofar. But it's shofar. It's shofar material. And min b'minoi ein a chaitzitz. Ve'einanu rayin k'moy nital. We don't look at it as if it's halachically not here, so that the shofar is not connected to your mouth. No, the shofar is connected to your mouth. The problem is that there's a chatzitza. The kosher part of the shofar is not directly connected to your mouth because there's a pasula section of the shofar that is interposed. But we don't recognize that as being a halachic interposition. Why? Because it's min b'minoi, and min b'minoi is ein a chaitzitz. And the Chavetz Chaim says, if you have a shasat chak, if you don't have another shofar, you could rely on this Bala Itor and this Ritz Geus. Very fascinating logic. Okay, we have a little bit of time left, so let's finish the page. Let's do Sif Yud. Says the Mechaber, Dibek shivrei shofrais zeh mzeh va'asa mehem shofar. You didn't have a shofar, so you took broken pieces of shofar, broken sections of shofar, and you glued them together to make a shofar. Puzzle, it's puzzle. Afilu im yesh b'shever shekedeged piv shir shofar. And it's even puzzle, let's say you had a section of shofar that was a tefach long, and it had a mouthpiece. So the truth is, you had a kosher shofar. Then you went there and you said, come on, I'm going to blow in this one tefach long shofar. It doesn't have a nice coil. It doesn't look nice. It's not covered at tzibur. So you took other pieces of shofar and you glued them on. That's also puzzle. Even though this bottom piece had the minimum size of a shofar. And you're already realizing why it's puzzle. It's puzzle because of the extension. Shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shtei shofros. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Nun Zayin. Dibek shivrei shofros. If you glued together sections of a shofar in order to make a shofar, hainu afilu lokach shivrei shofar shleimos biigulan. You took whole sections of shofar. They're whole in their circumference, and you glued them together. It's still possible. Even if you heated them up and you didn't use glue, you welded them together. So there's no problem of eina minoi. And even if it doesn't change the sound of the coil of the shofar, it's still all possible. Even if the section by the mouth has the minimum size of a shofar, it's still possible. You had the bottom piece was really kosher on its own, and you extended it in order to make it nice looking. You wanted to make it long. Or you wanted to have a nice, richer, deeper, louder coil. Pikein puzzle, still in all this shofar is puzzle, v'atam, and the reason for all these psulim are the shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shnei shofaros. The Torah Kedosha says that we have to blow in a shofar. Shofar echad amar Rachmana, one shofar, v'lo shnei shofaros. Over here you're taking different pieces that have been separated and gluing them together. That becomes shnei shofaros, and the Torah dermons shofar echad. We have to have one shofar that we blow in, not multiple shofars. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's refuahs and parnasa to all those in need. A special wish for a refuah shalem to our good friend Shlomo Zalman ben Mesha and Menachem Aryeh ben Dina Yehudis. They should have a refuah shalema b'sei shar chol Yisrael. I used to mention the name Yisrael Tzvi ben Rechama Edel Roiza. Baruch Hashem, he's doing much, much better. It seems he had a refuah shalema, and therefore I'm no longer mentioning his name. But the others should have a refuah shalema b'sei shar chol Yisrael, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek b'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.